Chapter 8. Labor the Eighth. How Hercules destroyed Certoine mares which fed upon human flesh. Once upon a time, that time being the mythological era of Greece, there lived one Diomedes, king of Bistonia in Thrace, who was celebrated for his mares, as well he might be since the said mares, rejecting corn and beans, were accustomed to eat men. Whether this taste of theirs was innate or acquired, whether it had been engendered by Diomedes for a physiological experiment, or for kings' ideas of jocularity were formerly often singular, for fun, or whether the animals had associated in early youth with hyenas, and had imbibed their propensities, we cannot say. Diomedes, perhaps, was a political economist, who, in order to reduce the surplus population of his territory, occasionally turned out those mares to graze among the paupers, who were more like grass than any other kind of flesh, being not only especially liable to be cut down, but also being continually trodden on. At least so it was while paupers were. No doubt the subjects of Diomedes objected to becoming pasture, and being mown as human hay, and were not a little rejoiced when Hercules undertook to put down their sovereign stud. In this undertaking he succeeded. He conveyed the mares away, first having regaled them on the carcass of their owner, and turned them loose on Mount Olympus, where they finally came to be eaten up themselves by the bears. Once again upon a time, when Hercules was last on earth, there existed monsters like the mares of Diomedes. These monsters were of the feminine gender, and they drew a certain vehicle called the car of fashion. We may therefore compare them to mares. Their names were Pride and Vanity, so that there was only a pair of them and not a stud, but their appetite was enormous, and their victims were without number. What was peculiar to them, however, was, that they had no notion of the kind of food which they devoured, nor suspected that it was odd but ordinary provender. This singular circumstance arose from their being totally blind, and from their nostrils being continually filled with incense, offered up by certain idolaters to fashion, which impaired their sense of smell. Also from their being naturally devoid of taste. For an ordinary mare, 14 hands would be a considerable height, but these mares were much higher than that, and those who rode them might have been emphatically said to ride the high horse, for a mare is a horse, although the converse of the proposition is untenable. They were gaily and jauntily tricked out with bows, and ribbons, and top knots, and their chariot was as of gilt gingerbread beset with gimcracks. Fashion herself sat upon the box driving this chaise and pair, her brows crowned with a garland of tulips, surmounted with a velvet cap of divers colors, of a conical shape, set about with gems, and decorated with a peacock's feather. Her arms were adorned with costly bracelets, her fingers with rings and jewels, and her person with a vest of glistening satin, displaying all the hues of the rainbow. Her waist was as the waist of a wasp, and she had wings at her back like unto those of a butterfly. Sometimes she sat, holding the reins of her car in one hand and a mirror in the other, in which she regarded the reflection of her own countenance, the only reflection that she had any taste for, with an expression of admiration and rapture. Sometimes she would drive standing on the point of one foot, the other being stretched out at right angles with her body, to give the spectators an advantageous view of her graces, and show them how pretty she looked. The prey on which fashion fed her mares consisted of young females. She, no less than the animals, was ignorant of its quality. She unconsciously occasioned the supply of it, but even if she had known what it was, it is probable that she would not have cared a spangle about the matter. She, wonderful to relate, existing without a heart. The young females whom Pride and Vanity devoured, we speak not of those fair beings who were eaten up by them in another sense, were the poor dressmakers and milliners. These unfortunate creatures were forced to sacrifice to those insatiable animals their life-blood, which was worked out of them by excessive toil, in order to furnish trappings for fashion and her car. Had they been devoured at once, their fate had been less grievous, but they were killed by inches, by tortures lingering and slow. Some ached at head and at heart to death, others were gradually smothered by consumption, others, in like manner, poisoned by close air, or worried by complicated miseries into an early grave. Hercules, revolving in his mind the evils which infested society, took cognizance of the case of these poor young women, and being, like all true heroes, a professed champion of damsels in distress, he conceived a strong feeling of indignation against fashion, her car, and the odious animals which drew it, and thereupon determined to upset the whole concern. He forthwith proceeded, with his arrows and his club, to demolish this idol of fashion, so he shot and battered away at her with all his might to reduce her from a goddess to a dummy. He knocked off the tawdry tinsel of her head dress, till he had reduced it to show like what it really was, a mere fool's cap. He bestowed a handsome thwack upon her head, that all might hear how hollow and empty it sounded. He drove one of his keenest darts through the place where her heart should have been, to convince the beholders, by her obvious insensibility to the wound, that she was without one. He dashed away her fallacious externals of elegance, and displayed the contrivances beneath them for screwing on this part, puffing out that, and transmogrifying the other, that every one might see what a thing of lies and nothingness she intrinsically was. The more effectually to disparage and bring her into contempt, he also attacked her priests and ministers, the hierophants of fiddle-faddle, who spoke, and sang, and wrote paragraphs in the newspapers to her praise and glory, till at last, fashionable intelligence became a theme of laughter even to scorn. He then seized pride and vanity by the mane, they had no bridle, and, stripping them of their feathers and fineries, he bade people look and see what sorry jades they were. And having thus exhibited them in all their meanness to derision, he demanded if it was to be borne that to these vile things should be immolated youth, and health, and beauty, that they should be allowed to batten on the agonies, and tears, and wasting flesh, and blood of an innocent girl. At first his words seemed as foolishness to the delicate votaresses of fashion, by whose means, unwittingly, the creatures had been pampered, and they only thought that the speaker was a coarse, rough person. A savage whose delight was to excruciate by his ferocious invectives the refined sensibilities of Ton, but Hercules, by a wave of his magic club, raised before their eyes a panorama of the ghastly wretchedness of which they had been the ignorant cause, and soon, on many a flaunting cheek, the factitious rose of the paint pot was merged in the blush of shame. He then, in the most gentlemanlike manner possible, applied his magic weapon to their habiliments, when lo! there ensued a marvel. The snowy cambric became crimson, the pink satin yellow, like the cheek of sickness, and the glossy silk dull, like its faded eye. Their finely strung nerves thrilled with horror, but when the elegant corset embraced the form which it invested with a glow like that of hectic fever, they screamed aloud with affright. Another flourish of the club annulled the transformation, and their terrors were relieved, but conviction had been wrought in their minds, and they tremblingly resigned pride and vanity into the hands of Hercules, to be dealt with according to his pleasure. In consequence of the renunciation of pride and vanity, a considerable impairment took place of the splendor of drawing rooms, soirees, the boxes of the Italian opera, and Regent Street of a summer's afternoon. The remaining partisans RTISANS of fiddle-faddle sighed bitterly over this altered state of things, and lamented with much pathos the departed glories wherein they had lived, and moved, and had their being. But to most eyes, beauty gained more in its adornments of goodness and mercy, than it lost in the matter of silk and satin. It will be inquired, what did Hercules do with pride and vanity? Some say that he turned them loose in Paris, where they were, after a long time, annihilated by common sense. But the more prevailing opinion is, that he sacrificed them to Jupiter. Chapter 9. The Ninth Labor, how Hercules obtained a girdle which appertained to royalty. Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, and afterwards, according to Shakespeare, Duchess of Athens, had a girdle, which was called the girdle of Mars. Hippolyta and her subjects were military and masculine ladies. This girdle, therefore, was probably like a soldier's belt. And her majesty, when she wore it, must have looked very much like Mr. Liston's Mal Flagon. The ninth labor imposed upon Hercules by Eurystheus was to get possession of this accoutrement for his daughter Admeta, a service of danger, for every individual of the Amazons was a regular Joan of Arc, or Maid of Saragossa, and they were regarded as the invincibles of their day. However, Hercules got the girdle. There was also a certain girdle with which the sovereign of England, whether king or queen, was invested as the head of the executive. For a royal cincture it was a very unpretending looking thing. It was no silk or satin sash, embroidered, studded with gems, and fastened with a gold buckle. No. It was just such a girdle as a friar might have worn. In fact, it was made of hemp. And it is proper to state, that the monarch only wore it in theory, for whatever difference of opinion may have existed as to its utility, no one would have regarded it as ornamental. Strange to say, however, it was actually worn occasionally by the subject, though never more than once by the same individual, and it then served not for a girdle, but for a necklace. This girdle, also, may be said to have been the girdle of Mars, for Mars was the god of hangmen. In a word, it was the halter. Hercules, who looked at the world and events with the eye of the mind, went one day to the court of Buckingham Palace. Around him were rank, splendor, and beauty. Uniforms, orders, stars, crosses, feathers, were glowing, glittering, waving brighter than the diamonds which encircled the brows, waving about on every side. Eyes, above them, were radiating in all directions. Perfumes loaded the air. On her throne, preeminent over this scene of magnificence, sat the young and lovely Queen of England. She wore, to ordinary eyes, what seemed to be merely the order of the garter, but to those of Hercules, it was accompanied by that of the halter, which he thought exceedingly ugly. He knew that it had not been put on by her own royal hands, nor by the delicate fingers of the ladies of the bedchamber, that her gracious majesty was not aware that she was wearing it, and that if she were so, she would be exceedingly glad to get rid of it. He therefore resolved to divest her fair form of this unbecoming decoration. The halter was a trapping with which royalty had been embellished by law. It was a contrivance for the protection of life and property, but not having been found practically to accomplish the latter object, it had been, after a long series of unsuccessful experiments, abandoned as far as that was concerned, and was now no longer employed to deter a famishing wretch from purloining a few shillings, or feloniously walking off with a lamb. It was still resorted to, however, as a preventive against murder, on that truly homeopathic principle, similia similibus currenter, are, whereon one fire burns out another's burning. But legislation and quackery were closely akin in those days. All that Hercules had to do was to procure the repeal of the enactments which maintained the halter. But this was no easy matter. The halter had many friends and supporters who considered it essential to the existence of society. Some of them venerated it as an ancient and time-honored appendage to the glorious Constitution, and not a few regarded it with interest as a property pertaining to the tragic drama of life, the decline of which, they, in their hearts, would have been sorry to behold. So the hero, in the accomplishment of this labor, encountered much opposition. Among the articles of the popular creed, was one which inculcated the duty of returning good for evil, and which distinctly repudiated the maxim of, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. Hercules demanded what difference there was between morality for the mass and morality for the individual. The answer which he received was, a good deal, and no other. With the hardest blows of his club, could he hammer out of the respondents. Instead of replying to his questions, they assailed him with abuse, calling him a profane person, a subverter of the established order of things, a mawkish sentimentalist, and other names. Well done, my fine fellows, cried Hercules, rally around the halter. Whereat, they howled and yelled, and hooted at him the louder. Then Hercules changed his tone, and affecting to be convinced that he had been in error, began to sing the praises of hemp, which he asserted to constitute the cord which held the community together, but for which mankind would instantly set about cutting each other's throats. Talk of the bond of charity, he would exclaim, pooh, the noose is the thing. But neither would people admit of this doctrine, and they indignantly asked what business had he or anybody to use such language as that. They were not beasts of prey, they said, lions, tigers, hyenas, but men Christians. Then you are not, said the demigod, deterred from doing murder by fear of the gallows. They replied, certainly not. But, they contended, the ignorant and the stupid and the brutal were. Hercules hereupon disguised himself as a recruiting sergeant, and taking a drum before him, and getting a fifer to precede him, he strutted forth playing the Grenadier's March. In a moment he had a score or two of ragamuffins at his heels, all ready to list. Death or victory, cried Hercules. Hurrah, shouted the rabble, 13 pence a day, my lads, safe, he exclaimed. Again they cheered. Who cares for the chance of a bullet? Not we, we should think not. Bullets, ho, ho, roared the populace with scorn. Get along with you, you vagabonds, said the hero, dispersing them with his club. So much, gentlemen, for the fear of death. But John Bull was a strong-minded fellow. He was not to be laughed out of his convictions, not he. Hercules, however, resolved to persevere. Accordingly he gave a grand banquet, Whereunto he invited the ministers, several of the judges, a bishop or two, a large number of ladies of title, and all the most distinguished personages in the world of fashion, of science, and literature. A hero was always able to command good society, particularly if he gave good dinners, so they were very glad to come. Dinner being ended, and the cloth removed, Hercules rose, and requested his distinguished guests to allow him to call their attention to a toast which he was about to propose, the health of a gentleman present, to whom, he had no doubt, they would feel extremely happy to do that honor. A gentleman whose important services to the state, he hoped no one present would ever require them, performed under the most trying circumstances, entitled him to public gratitude, and particularly to the thanks of all those who were concerned in the administration of justice. He had that gentleman now in his eye. Here the looks of the illustrious assembly were all directed to the quarter indicated by Hercules, where, next to a young and beautiful countess, sat a short, squat, burly man with a flat head, coarse features, and sunken eyes, who had been till now unnoticed by any one, or, if he had passed for some stupid nobleman. I beg, continued the illustrious demigod, to propose the health of Jack Ketch. A scene of the utmost confusion instantly ensued. The young countess screamed and fell down in a fainting fit. A universal exclamation of horror and disgust broke forth, and an expression of indignation and loathing sat on every countenance. The ladies turned pale, the noble lords looked ferocious, the judges frowned, and the meek eyes of the bishops flashed fire. Hercules, with well-feigned astonishment, protested that he did not know what was the matter. A noble duke there present begged respectfully to ask the distinguished demigod whether he considered such conduct on his part fit and proper, and hospitable treatment of his right honorable, and reverend, and illustrious guests. Such conduct as what? Answered Hercules. Nay, really, said his grace, I must beg your mightiness's pardon, but look at that person. And he pointed to Jack Ketch, who returned the compliment with an ominous leer. Well, replied the hero, is he not a man and a brother? Have you not enacted that if no hangman can be found, the sheriff is to perform his part? Why may not Jack Ketch be a respectable man? I do not, said the duke, object to his station in life, being quite aware that to a divine understanding, such as that of your mightiness, all men are equal, but to ask us to dine with the common hangman. The common hangman, said Hercules, what then, has the accessory any right to be ashamed of his principle? You, all and each of you, who uphold Jack Ketch, are his accomplices. The fairest lady among you who would continue him in his office lends a hand to tighten the noose which throttles a fellow creature. Ah, screamed all the ladies in unison. And now is it not too bad of you, continued Hercules, to impose a participation in this man's deeds upon your very sovereign, to force the royal hand, by its signature, to the death warrant, to become the primum mobile in the work of butchery? They had nothing to say in reply. Get out, said Hercules to Jack Ketch, we have now had enough of your company. Well, good people, what say you? Will you consent to relieve royalty of this elegant, this Christian ornament, the hempen girdle, and to resign it into my custody? They now saw the force of the arguments of Hercules, and shortly afterwards an act of parliament was passed for dispensing in future with the services of Jack Ketch, and for the everlasting disuse of the halter, which the head of the executive gladly resigned into the hands of Hercules, who formally made a present of it to Punch, to perpetuate, in the execution of Jack Ketch, the memory of his triumph over legal homicide.